Hello and welcome to another brand new episode of What the FinTech, the podcast from the team behind Fintech Futures and the Banking Technology magazine. My name is Cameron Emanuel-Burns, a reporter at Fintech Futures, and for this episode I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Natasha Sarin, a lead product owner overseeing data and AI for Lloyds. And today we're going to be discussing the relationship between traditional banking and AI, as well as her work shaping Lloyds' Gen AI strategy. Anyway, first of all, how are you, Natasha, and welcome to the show.
I'm good, thank you, Cameron. How are you? Thank you for having me.
We're delighted to have you. We were speaking just before, of course, we first met at our Banking Tech Insights all around agentic AI at the beginning of the summer. It's not quite the same weather now, but I know you've been doing a lot of other kind of speaking engagements recently. What was the event you were at last week?
Yeah, absolutely. So last week I was at the Next Gen Banking Summit actually in Canary Wharf. And it was great to see some leaders from the industry, other banks. So companies like NatWest. We also met some people from JP Morgan, HSBC, and a couple of tech startups as well. It was really interesting to just understand perspectives across the industry and what different people are working on and how they're tackling common issues. So it was a great way to start, I guess, this winter period.
Yeah, and I hear that although it's not happened yet, but you're going to be doing a webinar with our very own Dharmesh soon. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're doing a webinar on AI and banking and discussing all the ins and outs in terms of opportunities, risks, what we can expect in the future. I think a couple of mystery questions as well.
Well, I'm sure people will be keeping an eager eye out for that. But let's find out a bit more about you. Give us a bit of an introduction into your current role and a bit about your career up to now.
Yeah, sure. So at the minute, I am a lead product owner for working across data and AI within Lloyds Bank. My focus over the last couple of years has predominantly been with unstructured data. So working across data types like customer messages through chat, customer call data, clickstream data, so how a customer interacts with the app or web pages, document data. And yeah, that's just a couple really to name a few. It's really, if you think about it, just all the different types of customer interactions that we have with the bank. And my role has involved looking at kind of both the engineering side of how we bring all that data together, but also how we actually make use of it so we can understand our customers in more detail, which can inform how we interact with them in a more personalized way, but also how we make sure that their processes with the bank, for example, when they open a new account or put in a request for a new loan, we can actually speed up that process for them and make it a bit easier. So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years. Before that, I was still at Lloyds Bank really, because I've been there for 8 years now. So when I finished my degree, and I specialized in engineering, I then moved on to first take a year out really just to get some traveling across places like Malaysia and Japan. And then kind of after that time, I knew that I wanted to try something in the digital space. I really enjoyed engineering as a degree, but it just wasn't something I wanted to pursue. I had an interest in other types of technology because my speciality was on kind of more buildings and bridges, that type of engineering. And so when I found this job, it was part of a graduate scheme. It was great because it meant that you could work across all the different types of digital banking at the time. And so I got to work across things like customer spending, kind of everyday offers or spending rewards that they might use on their account, understanding how we help customers understand their spending habits. And then I really fell into data and analytics by accident. It was something I wanted to try out. And I guess a happy accident because I fell in love with it. It was really almost like a startup size at the time when I started my journey there in the bank. And I've loved all phases of it, where we started off with traditional, what we call more structured machine learning. So looking more at data types like transactions, for example, and really kind of that was more the predictive era of you have your train and your test data set, and then you have a very clear outline of what you're trying to predict with that model, and watched it transition really and grow into this whole new era of generative AI. And now we're finally hitting the agentic AI wave. So I think I've kind of seen almost like 3 phases of history already with AI in those 8 years at the bank.
Well, firstly, I'm very jealous about your travels to Japan. That is right at the top of my list. It's been fascinating to hear that, all your different stages. We've got a lot of questions, obviously, on AI and especially generative AI to come up. But I was wondering, so how does your team fit within Lloyds' broader technology and innovation strategy?
Sure. So I sit in the analytics and agentic platform, or we call it agentic and AI services to be more precise. So we basically focus on building different tools to help the rest of the bank. That spans across anything AI or anything agents, based agents or agentic AI, if you tie the two together. And that can range across kind of bringing in safely the right types of generative AI models, understanding how we create agents for the bank and how we make that more consistent and easily accessible for the rest of the bank, how we use all the data points I mentioned before to help add more context to conversations we're having with customers, or how making conversations more personalized with customers. And really, it's a broad range across all those different things, but it really is there to just support almost like the modernization of the bank in terms of our technology estate and how we're adding AI as a common theme into our infrastructure, really.
I guess from that, what are these initial use cases that convince Lloyds to invest in generative AI technologies?
Yes, I think if I think back on the original wave and how it all started back in the day when the early era of ChatGPT and when all these new other generative AI models were coming out, whether they were open source or through Microsoft or Google, I think the first thing that we really saw across any industry was the fact that we could suddenly take all these data sets that we couldn't really make sense of easily before. So what I mean by that again is things like, your large data sets of big documents as an example, where that could be in a bank. We're talking about like huge documents in terms of policies, or it might be guidelines as an example, right? Or maybe even a company report. And historically, you would have had to really spend the time manually going through it page by page, trying to understand and analyze things. We know how long things like annual reports are. And let's be honest, most policy documents, they're not exactly a fun read. And I think when this wave of generative AI hit, what really changed in the first instance was we quickly saw through kind of pilots, or what we call proof of concepts, that all of a sudden you could make a query around all those different documents, or to basically ask a specific question in a more human way, because the way you can ask the question with this technology is natural language. And suddenly you could have an answer and you could identify the exact piece of information or pieces of information you were looking for across all these documents and vast data sets. And that, I think, was the first moment where there was a real game changer in the industry, and probably across a number of industries, where we suddenly realized how powerful this was. And if you think about that in terms of time and hours, you're reducing what would have taken you possibly even days to draw conclusions on things. And all of a sudden you could do it in seconds. And I think that was the moment when we realized, okay, this is big. This is something really transformative compared to how we used to be able to look through all these different types of data and make sense of it, and how we can actually do it with this technology.
Oh, nice. Super. It sounds like, well, I know that you've overseen a lot of these transformations, but I'm wondering, what project or products have you enjoyed working on most while you've been at Lloyds?
Sure. So I think if we go back to the example I just alluded to, I think one of the projects or products was those specific use cases or examples where in the technology or approach or tool, it's called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. And I think that was one of the projects I really enjoyed working on at the time, where initially it was just lots of pilots where we were trying to tap into different processes and data sets and really say, hey, can we do something here? Can we make this quick? And I think that was really interesting to me, where we spent time looking at the data and then we would basically ingest, parse, chunk it, and index it, which basically means you then can easily retrieve the information because it's then been sorted into a more structured way. And that means you can then generate from that more context-aware responses. And we've seen that now materialize into something that's actually used in the bank. So one of the areas where they use it today is what we call the knowledge management chatbot. So that's the group's first productionized generative AI product. And within 10 months of launch, that reached around 11,000 users across 4 of our business areas. And that supports around 28 million calls that we receive a year from customers. So essentially, it enhances the ability to be able to look through information you might need whilst on the call with a customer and really support kind of getting the answer or helping the customer with the right process or query they might have in a much more timely manner. I think other things I've really enjoyed. So I spent a bit of time working on some use cases with graph networks. That was really exciting because with graph networks, you can have lots of different data points. So let's take the example of you might want to build a warning system to support something like fraud detection. You can basically look at all these data points that are disconnected, and it can suddenly draw some conclusions and create almost like that network of understanding where you can see those common themes between the different data points. And I think that was really exciting for me from a technology perspective as well. And I think now we're kind of entering that era of the next step of personalization. And so I think something else that I've really enjoyed is how we can use different data points to understand how we can make the tone of voice with the customer more personalized through interfaces like chat. So you would make a response more specific to a customer based on their circumstances or based on the type of question. For example, you might want to be more empathetic in certain scenarios where there might be financial difficulties versus someone who's talking excitedly about opening a new account towards their saving goal. And I think it's really about entering that era of how do we connect more with the customer through all these interfaces that before were quite robotic on things like chat.
Yeah, it sounds super interesting, all the different projects, of course, that you're overseeing and implementing at Lloyds. I'm wondering, how exactly is generative AI transforming the internal operations at Lloyds?
Yeah, it is really exciting. I think, as I briefly mentioned before, there are a number of different ways you can apply this technology to support internal operations. But the way I would break it down really is 2 categories where I think generative AI is having the biggest impact at the minute. So what I mean, the 2 categories I'm referring to here are reactivity and proactivity. So with reactivity, what I mean by that is by utilizing the technology, and what's important to remember here is the data. So if you have the right type of data available, it's good quality, you can access it in real time, you can then start to use generative AI alongside that data to react more quickly. So for example, you might be able to monitor cases of fraud in real time and therefore kind of support detection and correction when it comes to, for example, let's say in the modern world, you have these kind of agents and they're trying to commit fraud through chat or messenger. We can start to try and think about how we would detect that in a more kind of timely manner and something that's always on, in terms of we're always trying to detect if that's there. On the other side, proactivity, it's more about how do we kind of almost support things that people or customers might need really in the moment, or kind of suggest things that we think could help them. And they may be contacting us about one product, but then the conversation can easily change. So they may want to reach out to us about starting a mortgage. But if we're more proactive by utilizing the context in the conversation, we can quickly understand, okay, perhaps they actually also need a current account or savings account, or maybe they even need a different type of mortgage than they originally thought. So I think it's around how do we always kind of monitor to make sure things are safe, but also how do we utilize this technology to really support needs in a more personalized way or more proactive way. I think if we go into more specific examples, one area where it's quite interesting at the minute is when you look at lots of documents that need to be processed in the bank. So things like your loans or your mortgage documents. Somewhere where this technology can help through what we call document AI is it can quickly extract that information or summarize that information So we're not having to go through each document and always read it. We can actually have that document processed through that system, and then we have all the details kind of delivered in a much quicker way for us to then analyze and take customers to the next step really on those processes or services. So they're essentially improving their customer experience as well, really.
Well, absolutely. And it sounds like, again, there's just so many projects ongoing, but because of that, I imagine there has been some challenges, and I'm wondering what the biggest one has been for you while trying to implement Gen AI at Lloyds.
Yeah, absolutely. We touched briefly on data, and I think data is one of the areas I'll start with. So I think what's really key is data here. When we talk about generative AI or agentic AI, you really have to think of it as the foundations before you can apply those tools or technology. It's really important to make sure that the quality is there, because if your data is not in a good state, when you're processing it through those AI tools, if you put something rubbish in, you're going to get rubbish out. So it's really key to make sure that it's in good shape, the quality is there. I think also accessibility, so making sure instead of having data split across disparate systems and sources, it's more accessible in one place, because that makes it easier then to be consumed by your different AI models. We also want to kind of consider how the architecture overall looks for these solutions when we're applying these AI tools as part of the solution. So what I mean by that is there is always a lot changing when it comes to the different components you're adding into your designs when you're coming up with these solutions. For example, we know there are always new generative AI models being developed. Obviously, things are now moving forward at a much quicker pace with agents being added into the mix. And so I think another important point to note here is that you make sure what you're building is extensible and it can be altered in the future if you need to swap a different model in or add in a new component like a new agent. And that will kind of, I think, last the test of time a bit more than something that's very kind of rigid, standalone, it's once and done. I think it's important to kind of build and design these things where they're almost agnostic in terms of integration points. So they are interchangeable in the future and therefore can adapt. The other thing to consider is with any companies that have large data and engineering teams, you always need to be analyzing what makes more sense based on the market. Is it sensible to bring in a solution from outside because it's just adding that additional bit of value that we can't build ourselves quickly? Or is it better to just do something more customized that we have full ownership of and we can build ourselves from scratch? So I think it's always important to have a lens on what can we do ourselves versus what can we do externally, but really make those decisions in a logical way. So you're not tying yourself, for example, into, let's say, 10 outside solutions or third-party systems that will make everything internally a bit of a mess.
Absolutely. And I think when speaking to a lot of members of the public, especially around AI, there's a lot of fear as well around how it's going to be using their information primarily. And so I guess an important question for yourself, obviously at a legacy bank, is how do you guys ensure that the AI generated financial information remains accurate and reliable for your customers and staff?
Absolutely. So I think trust is really key. I think first of all, it's always important in whatever you're designing and building in our bank or in any company to make sure that the customers are aware that technology is being used and having their consent really in terms of using this technology as part of their customer experience, because they may not want AI tools to be used as part of the products they're acquiring or the services they're interacting with. So I think it's really key, first of all, to make sure that there's consent or things are disclosed up front. I think then beyond that point, if you are using that technology, it's really about, I think, applying human logic and human principles to your design. So what we build is going to continuously change, but I think the human element to it in terms of what we consider a design level should be instilled within the teams that are designing these processes to make sure they're always considering those angles when they're building the tools or building those solutions. So things like bias. They need to make sure, or your team needs to make sure, that you're not using a biased data set. You're making sure that it is fair. So it's not skewing the output one way or another towards one demographic or type of customer, as an example. You need to make sure that you're continuously monitoring things once they've been built, so you can make sure that there's not drift in a certain way or things are leading to kind of unfair outcomes. I think that's really important as well, to make sure that's not happening. I think also transparency is really key. So really understanding how the system works end to end. If you can, one good option is always to go with models that are open source, because it means you can actually understand like how the model was trained, what data was used. And one good framework that they have out there is the Model Transparency Score framework, that allows you to actually look for each model you might consider using, what data it was trained on. It assesses things like compute and model access as well. I think all those factors are really important. As I said, I think they need to be, obviously, you always need to have your governance frameworks, right? And your guardrails. But I think it's really important in team design to have those principles in mind, because every scenario or case is going to be different when you're building something. And so you need to almost have those thoughts when designing the solution, because you need to make sure that you're considering angles potentially that haven't been thought through or you've come across before.
Yeah, no, some really important points brought up there. And I guess you've spoken about a lot of use cases today, but I'm wondering, which emerging generative AI capabilities are you most excited about for the banking industry?
I think a lot is always changing at the minute, given how many things we're seeing pop up on a daily or weekly basis. But I think the common trends that I've heard of recently, or themes I'm seeing, so the first one we've already mentioned, it's the buzzword everybody's using at the minute, agentic AI. I think this is the one really where it's that next step of, we're no longer thinking just about adding in AI models to our processes, to our solutions, to help kind of take them to that next level of giving us something that's more automated, as something in a singular way. It's really helping us think about the process end to end. So it's that next step of what action can be carried out. So when we're designing, if we set a goal, it's really allowing the agent and the large language model, as an example, to take that goal you've prescribed and then reason and come up with their own solution to achieve the outcome. And I think what that will mean is, in previous examples of using AI or generative AI, we talk a lot about adding in a human in the loop to help manage things where we're not quite sure we can trust the output. We know there are issues potentially like hallucinations with generative AI models, which are quite common, where what they're actually generating is false or not quite right. I think with agentic AI, what we're going to see instead is, because it's adding that next level of agency in terms of how the outcome is achieved, it's completely determined by the agent and the LLM. It won't be humans in the middle of the chain. It will start to become humans at the beginning and the end. And so, as I said, humans will define that goal, and then it's up to the agent and the large language model to achieve in that goal. But then, instead of being in the middle, humans will also be at the end. So they'll be at the beginning defining the goal, and then the end of the process to make sure that the outcome that it's produced is fair, it makes sense, and that's being monitored, and kind of there at the end to act as a fail-safe in the actions and not so much just the answers anymore. So I think it will change how humans interact with the technology, because it will switch from them being sort of like a middle link in the process to almost like defining the beginning and the end. I think what else we'll see, just more, that will then generate more autonomous decisions. Today, there are very few autonomous decisions. I think it was almost that only is not that long ago, I think 2024, one of the reports I saw, it was only 0% still in terms of autonomous decisions and day-to-day work. But I think it will be around 15%, they're saying, by 2028, according to one of the Gartner reports. Another theme we'll see is systems are designed differently, where they're no longer specific to a domain. So it's no longer specific to something like a mortgage product or closure of an account or opening of an account or trying to look at something else entirely different. Beyond that, I think we'll start to see systems or interactions acting as one entity. So what I mean by that is, instead of you having to go through different queues and different processes to talk about your mortgage or talk about your savings account in this example, you'll start to see the interactions just as one thing where they'll no longer be specific to that domain or that journey, but we'll start to see, for example, you'll have a chat and it will just be able to support you with everything in one. And I think we'll see that more and more with banks now, where a customer will approach and ask a question and they'll be able to directly support them on any kind of question or product, really. And it won't have to go through all those different specific queues anymore. So I think those are some of the things we'll see over the next couple of years.
Oh, perfect. And obviously you're really knowledgeable about agentic AI. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, if anyone was fortunate enough that out there who's listening to this, you may have obviously heard and listened to Natasha speaking about it at our Banking Insights of Tech Insights event earlier in the year. Okay, so a bit more broader this time. How do you see the relationship between traditional banking and AI evolving over the next 5 years?
Sure. So I think apart from what I already mentioned, I think other things we'll see are more AI native applications and natural language interfaces. So what that means is AI will become more the core of applications now, where we'll see them more as the primary functionality. There'll be more continuous learning, adaptive behaviors. I think we'll also see more natural interfaces. So, for example, you'll be able to kind of directly interact with these tools through chat, through speaking, through sending an image, through video. I think the ability to support customers through all those different mediums will become much more simplified and streamlined, where it doesn't matter how you're interacting. That information can be immediately processed and then you can be supported on your need. I think as well, we will start to see just redesign. So I think before we talked about how humans interact with AI and agentic AI differently in the future. I think the other thing is we'll just see design overall change. I think it's quite difficult to foresee how an industry or area will change overall because of technology. I think it's sometimes difficult to imagine what that future looks like when we don't fully understand the impact set or how it can be used. But I think one example I always think of is the mass production movement from Henry Ford. So he looked at the production line in terms of how cars are produced at scale and used technology to do that. And he thought about redesigning the process completely differently to how it'd been done before. And so the tools were brought to the employees instead of the employees going to the tools. And that was done in such a different way that it was almost like the beginning of mass production. I think we could start to see things like that in terms of redesign, where we keep talking about making processes more efficient, for example, with Gen AI or agentic AI, but they could almost just create things or almost like give us a surge of thinking about problems or new processes in an entirely different way that we haven't even thought of yet. I think that's what I'm getting at here. I'm not sure I'm articulating myself that clearly, but I think that just kind of the overarching point is there will be new things we haven't even thought of yet.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for chatting with us today. And to finish our episode, we always have our infamous Fintech Jail, where we ask for an industry term, buzzword, or trend that you may have seen or simply just heard enough of and want to get rid. Or, of course, you can advocate to free one of the previously incarcerated terms. So, Natasha, what will your selection be today?
I think this was quite a hard one, to be honest, Cameron. I debated back and forth as to whether I wanted to send agentic AI to jail because I think it's used so interchangeably. And I think everybody I speak to has a different definition of what agentic AI means. But instead, I will add to the list, it's quite boring and it's been heard of before in some ways, and we've referenced it now, but I think for me, it will become more key. So the term I'm going to add to the list is open source. And the reason I want to add that is because I think it will become more important now in terms of transparency and observability with these new systems we're designing, because we're hearing things around digital ID for each person in the UK becoming mandatory or resident in the UK. We're also aware of new tools like Model Context Protocol or MCP. What it really is a universal USB port. So what it means is models no longer need to always interact with things through APIs. They can just interact with lots of different tools with with MCP. And I think that will become interesting because through interfaces like ChatGPT, it means that it's much easier for the next action to be carried out through the query you're entering. So you could ask for it to make a change in another app for you. And that could be as simple as something like your music app in Spotify. But who knows, in the future, that could extend to something that touches money or monetary value in a way. And I think for me, maybe I'm talking in a fantasy language now of where this could get to, but I think that's why I feel strongly about open source, because I think it will just become more and more important to understand underneath the hood what's happening in terms of how this technology was built, how it functions, and therefore help us prevent cases of fraud or having it used in a dangerous way in the future.
Well, I think you've given a very strong account for open source. No, that's excellent. And I wanted just to thank you once again, Natasha, for giving us your insights today. And it sounds like you're going to be very busy on the media circuit with Dharmesh soon. So I wish you good luck for all of that. And we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you so much to Natasha for joining me. As for Fintech Futures, you can find us online at fintechfutures.com and be sure to follow us on LinkedIn to keep up to date on the latest fintech news. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or your favourite podcast service to get notified about all our future episodes. And thanks as well to Arama for editing this podcast. You can check them out at arama.tv. And as always, thank you everyone for your support, and we'll see you soon for another episode of What the FinTech. But until then, goodbye.